Over the course of my last two programs, I've been discussing, firstly, the possible Russian plans for a big offensive, maybe this summer, and also the widespread rumors and claims, mostly, it must be said, coming from Russian sources, that the Ukrainians are planning an offensive of their own. I say rumors, but of course they've been given the authority of no less a person than President Putin himself, and they have also been supported by the various reports and commentaries that we get from Group of Forces North. Now, these discussions about offensives and counteroffensives by the Russians and by the Ukrainians have perhaps drawn attention away somewhat from the actual situation on the battlefronts, and it is to that I'm going to initially return in this program. And I'm going to say straight away that we still see the Russians retaining the initiative right across the contact line, including, by the way, in Kharkiv region, a point made by no less a person than the new Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov in discussions he had with Russian army cadets in the Kremlin just yesterday. So the Russians still retain the initiative, and they are continuing with the process of attrition, or as I'd like to call it, aggressive attrition. And the level of aggressive attrition over the last week, that by Russians' own claims they inflicted on the Ukrainians, was simply appalling. Now, as it often does, the Russian Defense Ministry on Friday published a weekly summary of what had happened on the battlefronts across Ukraine over the previous week. Notably, like most Russian military summaries, official military summaries, it did not go into the details about territorial captures or territorial losses, except that it referred to the Russian capture of a village called Zagorny in Zaporozhye region, a capture which, by the way, as I've already said, I don't fully understand the significance of. But consider what they say about that topic which they report in the greatest detail. That is Ukrainian losses, both of manpower and equipment. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, last week, 13,740 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded on the line of contact. Now, that, as the Russians themselves have pointed out on several occasions, in fact, no less a person than Putin himself has said this, that does not include Ukrainian soldiers and military personnel who are killed in Russian missile strikes in positions far back behind the line of contact. The Russians acknowledge that they don't have full details about this. But just on the line of contact alone, the Russians say that over the course of the last week, they killed or wounded 13,740 Ukrainian troops. Now, that's a terrifyingly high total. I think it is the highest total that the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed for losses suffered by the Ukrainian military in any single week in the conflict so far. It's higher, for example, than what the Ukrainians were losing, or what the Russians claimed at the time the Ukrainians were losing during Ukraine's disastrous counteroffensive last summer. And this at a time when the Ukrainians are not conducting offensives, when the Russians are attacking them right across the line of contact, but the Russians have not yet launched a big general offensive of their own. The Russians are pushing forward. They're conducting, as I said, aggressive attrition. They're gradually eating away at the Ukrainian lines, gnawing at their lines, as somebody put it. But we haven't yet had a general Russian offensive exploiting the gains that they have achieved in the fighting that has taken place since the Avdiivka offensive began back in October. So despite the fact, as I said, that we are still looking at a situation where it's the Russians advancing but not conducting an offensive, aggressive attrition, according to the Russians, has caused the Ukrainian military to lose 13,740 men, dead and wounded, over the course of a single week. And as I said, this is a rising trend. I can remember how way back a couple of months ago, I was talking about how the Russian Defense Ministry was reporting that the Ukrainians were losing between 5,000 and 7,000 men each week. And that seemed like very high losses. This was at the time of the fighting in Avdiivka at the start of this year. Well, that's now, as I said, increased to more than double that, 13,740. And we're looking, therefore, at Ukrainian losses. Of course, all this is according to the Russians of, well, somewhere over 50,000 men dead and wounded each month. And there's no reason to think that this terrible toll that's been inflicted on the Ukrainians is going to fall. On the contrary, more likely than not, it's going to increase. And of course, if the Ukrainians really do launch a counterattack of their own, then it is going to increase even further. Now, this rate of loss is unsustainable. Ukraine is currently going through a mobilization process. There's lots of arguments and discussions about how successful that is. The New York Times, I believe, has written another piece talking about how many Ukrainians are resisting mobilization and are trying to evade it. Other reports, however, claim that the Ukrainians have indeed managed over the last couple of weeks, since the mobilization law was passed by the Ukrainian parliament in March, to mobilize something like 100,000 men to fill the gaps. But that's March, April, May. We're now at the end of June. 100,000 men over that period would still not fully replace losses if those losses really are happening at the rate of 50,000 a month. Now, I say that, of course, I don't know how accurate exactly these Russian claims are. No one does. But the Ukrainians themselves acknowledge the fact that they have been suffering terribly high losses ever since the special military operation began, and that their losses have been growing. Every so often, Ukrainian commentators and people who are perhaps not exactly officials, but people who are close to the authorities, people like, for example, the former Ukrainian prosecutor, Yuri Lutsenko, come forward and admit to casualty figures not so very different from the ones that the Russians say the Ukrainians have suffered. And of course, back in the autumn, there were reports attributed to General Zaluzhny, who was at that time the Ukrainian military chief, that he was seeking 500,000 men from the mobilization in order to replace losses. Ukraine has also refused to demobilize soldiers. They were promised at one time that soldiers who had been serving in the military since February 2022 would indeed start to be demobilized so that they could rejoin civilian life and rest. Well, the Ukrainian military, almost as soon as General Zaluzhny was leveraged out of his job, as soon as General Syrskyi took over, he basically countermanded that, so that all Ukrainian soldiers are obliged to continue serving, even those who have been in the army now for 2.5 years. 2.5 years of continuous war. And again, it's difficult to believe that the Ukrainians would have done such a thing, such a deeply unpopular thing with the soldiers themselves, were it not for the fact that they are indeed suffering terrible losses. And whilst, as I said, I can't vouch for the exact accuracy of the Russian figures, nobody can, I have made a point before, and I want to repeat it again, because I think it is correct, that the Russians, when they publish these figures, they do at least give us an insight into the intensity of the fighting. So if reported numbers of Ukrainian casualties are falling, we know that there has indeed been a pause in the fighting. When the numbers, on the contrary, increase, we know that the fighting is becoming more intense. Now, there have been some reports, some claims over the last couple of days that there is some kind of a pause in the fighting going on, that the Russians have somehow lost momentum, that they're not advancing anymore. Something, by the way, which, as we will see shortly, is not confirmed, is on the contrary, it's contradicted by what is actually the movements on the front lines. But anyway, any idea that there's been some kind of a pause or a reduction of the fighting or a reduction in intensity of the fighting is directly contradicted by these Russian figures. Now, I've not just spoken about the fact that the fighting and the losses, the Ukrainian losses, are very intense. I've also suggested in the past that people are not always necessarily looking at the places where the fighting is taking place and where it is most intense. If you follow comments from Western officials, including, by the way, US Secretary of State Blinken, you would think that it is Kharkiv, the place where the Russian army has crossed the border and has encamped itself outside Lipsy and entrenched itself inside Volchansk. You might think that that is where the worst of the fighting is happening. Well, let's just look at what the Russian casualty totals, Ukrainian casualty totals for last week are actually telling us. They say that over the course of last week, the group of forces north inflicted 1,980 casualties on the Ukrainians. That's in Kharkiv region. But then we come to what's going on in central Donbass, the fighting in central Donbass. And there's three groups of forces, Russian groups of forces, operating in central Donbass. And a group of forces west claims to have inflicted 3,330 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Group of forces south claimed that they have inflicted 4,290 casualties on the Ukrainian forces, and group of forces center claimed that they have inflicted 2,530 casualties on the Ukrainian forces, all according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. So the three groups of forces fighting in central Donbass are each claiming that they have inflicted higher losses on the Ukrainians over the past week than group of forces north has done. And the record, by the way, is held by group of forces south. They say that they have inflicted losses on the Ukrainians of 4,290 men, as opposed to the 1,980 men that group of forces north have inflicted. Putin, in those comments that he made, which I discussed yesterday, the comments he made over the course of the press conference in Vietnam, said in effect that the fighting in Kharkiv region is a sideshow. He said that it is a tactical battle, not a strategic one. And we can see from where the Russians say that the losses are heaviest, that he is almost certainly right. Now, let's talk about what has been happening, not just over the course of last week, but over the course of the last 24 hours. Now, in this weekly summary that the Russian Defense Ministry publish, they didn't just publish reports about Ukrainian casualty figures on the combat line, they also discussed Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. And they say this: from 15th to 21st June, the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out 14 group strikes by high-precision air and ground-based weapons, as well as strike drones, which hit depots of military technical equipment, infrastructure of military airfields, electrical substations that supported the work of Ukrainian military hardware enterprises, and training centres for the use of uncrewed surface vehicles. The last, of course, are water drones. The strikes also hit deployment areas of nationalist groups and foreign mercenaries. So they confirmed that military strikes, missile and drone strikes, took place right across Ukraine, and they've given us a list of targets, and note that most of these targets that they've listed appear to be military installations, depots, training centres, that sort of thing, airfields. But note also the reference to attacks on electrical substations that supported the work of Ukrainian military hardware exercises. And last night, the Russians carried out another massive missile strike, drone and missile strike across Ukraine. And it was, in fact, the electrical substations that were the main target. Now, these electrical substations are the substations which transfer electricity from the power stations, and, by the way, the electricity that is now increasingly imported from Europe, that transfer them through the electric lines to the customers. Now, the Russians, over the course of the spring and summer, have launched a devastating offensive against the Ukrainian energy system. This is an offensive on a far bigger scale and far more methodical than anything that they did over the course of the winter of 2022-2023, when they first launched their strikes against the Ukrainian energy system. Over the course of those strikes in 2022-2023, the Russians avoided attacking the power stations themselves. This time, over the last few months, the Russians have indeed attacked the power stations and the energy generating facilities across Ukraine. And we understand that the thermal power stations, the power stations that work on coal and gas and oil, have been almost entirely destroyed. The Russians have also destroyed the bulk, perhaps the entirety, of Ukraine's hydroelectric stations, which, by the way, provided a significant part of the electric power that the Ukrainian energy system uses. What are left are Ukraine's nuclear power stations, and the Russians have given concrete undertakings, not just to the international community, but perhaps most specifically to their allies, to their friends in China and elsewhere, that they will not directly attack Ukrainian nuclear power stations for the obvious reasons that they do not want to create a nuclear accident. So Ukraine still produces electric power from its nuclear power stations, and it supplements the electric power it produces from its nuclear power stations by imports of electricity from the European Union. Now, I've seen some absolutely astonishing figures as to the extent of the collapse in output of the Ukrainian electrical system. By some reports that I've seen, Ukraine is now producing, as I said, almost exclusively now from its nuclear power stations, less than a fifth of the electric power that it produced when it gained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. The Ukrainian power system has quietly and steadily declined since then. It lost significant power stations in the Donbass in 2014, and it also lost the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and other energy-producing facilities in Zaporozhye and Kherson region in the fighting in 2022. But apparently something like half of the system remained still operating as of the autumn of 2022, which was basically just about enough to maintain Ukraine's needs. Now, less than 40% of that remains, and that is entirely provided by the nuclear power stations. Now, of course, there has been a massive collapse in Ukraine's industrial output over this period. The Ukrainian economy has significantly contracted in real terms, though getting Western officials and Ukrainian officials to admit that fact is something that is all but impossible. On the contrary, the Ukrainians continue to claim increases in GDP. We will discuss how they're doing that shortly. But the reality is that the real economy in Ukraine has been contracting under the pressure of the war. So the result is that energy use in Ukraine has fallen steeply, but with the thermal power stations and the hydroelectric stations no longer functioning, what is being produced is no longer enough, even for the depleted consumption that Ukraine still has. So that's why they're having to import electricity from Europe. Back in the 90s and 2000s, Ukraine was an energy exporter. It exported electricity to Eastern Europe. Today, it's obliged to import electricity from Eastern Europe, from the European Union. Now, how does this electricity get channeled through Ukraine? Well, this is where the electrical substations play their role, because it is through them that the electricity is received, redirected. They are an essential part of the electricity grid, Ukraine's electricity grid. Now, John Helmer, that most astute of observers of the Russian political scene, and somebody who has an unrivaled understanding, in my experience, of the thinking at the highest level of the political and military leadership of what he refers to as the Stavka, the military command headquarters, the military brains, if you like, of Russia. Anyway, he wrote an article way back in 2022 when the Russians first began their missile offensive against Ukraine's energy system. And he said that its primary purpose was not to knock out the system in its entirety, not at that time, but instead to focus on detecting its weaknesses, to find out how the system worked, so that when the moment came, the Russians would be able to attack the vulnerable points and basically cause the entire system to collapse. And of course, if you remember, as I do, the targets that the Russians were aiming for at that time, it was precisely the electrical substations. And that's what they are again starting to attack now. They did so over the last week, as the Russian Defense Ministry are telling us, and they did so again last night. Now, the point is that without the power stations working, and if the electrical substations are also destroyed and knocked out, then there is no mechanism for distributing electrical power across Ukraine. Now, the electrical system in Ukraine still has reserves of resiliency. Electrical substations can be repaired much faster than power stations can. But of course, it is becoming more difficult all the time. And at the moment, the demands on the power system are probably their lowest level over the course of the year, because we're in summer, temperatures are relatively high. That means that there's less need for power to keep homes warm across Ukraine. But of course, as winter approaches with the power stations gone and the substations damaged, and with the Russians now probably having a very clear idea of where the substations are located and how they work and what the interfaces between the system are. Well, as winter approaches, the prospects that the Ukrainian people face are starting to look exceptionally grim. Now, the Russians, of course, are very careful to justify these attacks. They previously said, when they started the special military operation, that they would not attack civilian infrastructure. And to some extent, they abided by that injunction, which they gave to themselves quite well, especially in the first few months. But also, they have to take into account that attacks on facilities that might inflict terrible harm on a civilian population, that can be considered a war crime. Now, they are justifying these attacks basically on two grounds. Firstly, they're saying that the electrical substations support the work of Ukraine's military hardware establishments. The Ukrainian military industrial complex, obviously, is a major user of electric power, and so the Russians say that since it's part of the military industrial complex, it's largely the military industrial complex that relies on the electricity provided by the substations. The substations are a legitimate target. Now, Western governments in the various bombing wars that they've conducted at various times against Yugoslavia, Iraq, other places, well, they've justified attacks on power stations and energy producing and distributing facilities in the same sort of terms. So the Russians probably feel that on that they are on reasonably secure ground. The Russians also have said in the past, though not interestingly in this particular Ministry of Defense report that I've just been discussing, that the attacks on the energy facilities in Ukraine are retaliation for Ukrainian attacks on the Russian oil and gas complex, the attacks by the Ukrainians on Russian refineries. Now, you can be deeply cynical or skeptical about these Russian claims. To a certain extent, I am. The attacks on the refineries, I've already discussed them. I've said that they're essentially pinpricks, despite some claims that you occasionally see to the contrary and some overheated rhetoric that takes place. And as for Ukraine having a genuinely functional and fully operational military-industrial complex by this stage in the war, with Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian defense establishments taking place, well, pretty much every day now. Well, again, I think that this is wildly overstated. I have no doubt that Ukraine still has factories that function up to a certain point. They're still able to repair tanks, for example. They can probably produce shells, at least, and small arms ammunition to some degree. They can produce water drones and things of that kind. But I don't think really, realistically, Ukraine's military-industrial base can be functioning in any very strong or purposeful way, given the realities of the war. Well, what is very strange, what I have to say, again, makes no sense to me is that both Ukraine and the Western powers seem intent on facilitating or justifying, if you like, these Russian explanations. Because though the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian oil refining complex are, as I have said many times, essentially pinpricks, the Ukrainians still persist in them, despite the fact that the United States allegedly disapproves, but they still persist in attacks on Russian oil refineries. And we have all kinds of Western military industrial companies like Rheinmetall, for example, and one of the big, I think it was General Dynamics in the United States, talking about how they are going to establish or have already established factories producing shells and other military equipment on the territory of Ukraine itself, which, to be frank, I think is certainly exaggerated, wildly exaggerated at this time. But again, that talk simply justifies, the Russians can cite it as proving that military industrial production is still taking place in Ukraine, which in turn justifies Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. We see what seem to me to be essentially theatrical or informational steps taken by Ukraine and its Western sponsors. The attacks on the refineries, the talk about building up Ukraine's military industrial base, which in fact have consequences for Ukraine that are overwhelmingly negative, in that they enable the Russians to justify their missile offensive on Ukraine's energy system, which is absolutely devastating in ways that the attacks on the refineries, for example, the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian refineries, are not. Anyway, it provides a legal justification for the Russians, which the Russians would not otherwise have. Now, in saying this, of course, I should make it clear that even if the Ukrainians were not carrying out pinprick strikes on Russian oil refineries, and even if companies like General Dynamics and Rheinmetall were not telling us stories about setting up military industrial production factories and facilities in Ukraine itself, most probably because it's part of their overall plan, the Russians would still be conducting strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities in the way that they are. But I still find it strange, I still find it bizarre that, as I said, for relatively trivial informational gains, both the Ukrainians and the Western powers are providing the Russians with excuses to justify that which they do. Anyway, that's their concern, but it perhaps shows once more the extent to which the informational part of the war, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the West, has a tendency to become dominant. Anyway, there are other things to be said about this. The Russians, over the course of this report, talked about how they carried out precision strikes using air and ground-based weapons. Now, the ground-based weapons overwhelmingly appear to be Iskander-M ballistic missiles, perhaps supplemented now by North Korean missiles, though I'm not sure that that really is the case, or at least has been the case up to now. Now, the interesting thing about the Iskander-M is that the Ukrainians themselves admit that they can't intercept it, that none of the air defense systems that Ukraine has, not the Patriots, not the Iris-Ts, not the NASAMS, none of them are able to intercept the Iskander-M, which is in effect, or operates in some ways, rather like a hypersonic missile, but which is also capable of complex maneuvers whilst in flight, which makes interception extremely difficult and all but impossible for the air defences that Ukraine is currently in possession of. Now, compare that with the ATACMS, about which we hear so much. There have been some attempts to talk up the ATACMS, but the reality is that the Russians do seem to be very successful in intercepting the ATACMS, which is, after all, a relatively old technology system. I understand it was designed and developed in the 1970s and entered production and service with the United States military in the 1980s. The Iskander-M, by contrast, is a much more advanced missile. And the Russians are able to use it and are using it every day across the battlefronts, perhaps on a even more regular basis than Ukraine is using its ATACMS missiles. After all, Russia produces its Iskander-Ms and it uses them to deadly effect, whereas, as we see when Ukraine launches its ATACMS, perhaps 1 out of 10 will manage to penetrate the Russian air defense system, and it's becoming probably increasingly difficult even for that limited number of ATACMS missiles to achieve that. Now, no one makes this contrast, except the only person who's done so up to now, as far as I know, is Brian Beletic. But there it is. The ATACMS is a potent missile, or was a potent missile in its day. It can do damage, but it's nowhere near as advanced, it's nowhere near as capable, and it's nowhere near as lethal as the Iskander-M is. And anybody who's been following the situation on the battlefronts will notice that the Russians have been launching ever larger and greater quantities of Iskander-Ms. The ground missile war, the war with ground missiles, is also tilting in Russia's favour. The Storm Shadows and the ATACMS are not able to make up the difference. The Russians now have a convincing superiority in terms of land-based ballistic missiles. Of course, they've always had a lopsided advantage in air-launched cruise missiles, and that's now increasing. And the Russians also are increasingly deploying their Tornado-S precision-guided multiple launch rocket systems. They seem to have many more of those than Ukrainian has HIMARS systems. The Russians are able to jam the HIMARS system. The Ukrainians apparently cannot jam the equivalent Russian Tornado-S. The technological advantages that many people in the West assume the West has provided Ukraine on examination don't really exist. Just saying. So we now have a new Russian system which has just entered into the battle. And in Kharkiv region, in northern Kharkiv region, where the fighting between group of forces north and the Ukrainians is taking place, the Russians have now unveiled and used the giant FAB-3000 bomb. Now, this bomb weighs 3 tons, and it has a warhead. It carries explosives, 1,600 kilos of explosive, 1.6 tons of explosive. It is a massive bomb, and I won't say that it's the biggest bomb around. The Russians have 9-ton bombs, and of course the United States also has enormous bombs as well, much bigger than the FAB-3000. But I believe I'm right in saying that in terms of tactical bombs, bombs that can be dropped by tactical aircraft, fighter bombers, the FAB-3000 is the biggest, and perhaps the biggest that there can be. That tactical aircraft like the Sukhoi 34 would not be able to carry heavier bombs than this. Now, it's assumed that the launch aircraft for these bombs is the Sukhoi 34, and it's also assumed that the Sukhoi 34 will have to carry specifically, designed systems to be able to carry a bomb of this weight. It's important to say, however, that if the Sukhoi 34 is operating with one FAB-3000 as opposed to, say, 2 FAB-1500s, then the overall weight that it is carrying is not going to be greater, and presumably that means that its flight characteristics are not going to be less than they would be if it were carrying FAB-1500s. Now, this is a massive bomb, nonetheless, the FAB-3000, and it's a very heavy bomb, and of course that does affect the way that it operates. It probably cannot be launched from the distance that the FAB-500s and FAB-250s and even FAB-1500s are launched from. So an aircraft that drops it has to come closer to its target, and that means that potentially it might risk coming within range of Ukrainian air defences, especially long-range air defences like the Patriots. So it has to be used in an environment where the Russians are confident that they have suppressed the long-range air defences. That's one thing. The second is that it's probably not the best bomb to use against more elaborate defences. Since you can only drop one, you have to basically select a single target. And we've had an explanation from a Russian source as to its probable use. And the source in question is a gentleman called Igor Korochenko. He's editor-in-chief of National Defense magazine. This is presumably a Russian military magazine. Russia has its military media, just as the United States does. Anyway, Mr. Korochenko has been interviewed by the TASS news agency, and TASS reports him as saying this: Russia's first successful use of a FAB-3000 glide bomb weighing over 3 metric tons indicates that Russian troops should scale up the use of this munition against key Ukrainian army sites, military expert, editor-in-chief at the National Defense magazine, Igor Korotchenko told TASS. Russian defense circles told TASS on June 20th that Russian troops had employed for the first time a FAB-3000 heavy-duty glide bomb in the Kharkiv direction during the special military operation in Ukraine. And then we have a quote from Korotchenko, considering a substantial strike effect of this munition, its use can be recognized as successful. Further on, it is necessary to scale up its use against key infrastructure facilities of the Ukrainian armed forces to provide for the successful advance. Note those words, key infrastructure facilities. And then TASS quotes Korotchenko as saying, this munition is primarily intended to break Ukrainian army defensive fortifications at the engagement line and wipe out enemy strongholds and communication centers. Note again the word communication centers. So it's basically designed to destroy fortifications, heavy fortifications, the sort of massive concrete bunkers and heavy industrial buildings that the Ukrainians use as fortifications along the line of contact. Places like the industrial plants at Azovstal, in Mariupol, the aggregate factory in Volchansk, the coke plant in Avdiivka, places like that. It can be used against them to break defenses. And in fact, the photos that we've seen of these massive bombs seem to be directed specifically against large Ukrainian buildings. And note again the references to key infrastructure facilities and communications centers. Bridges, perhaps the Dnieper bridges. A lot of discussions about the difficulties of destroying the Dnieper bridges, but the Russians can destroy these bridges. Their Kinzhal missiles and their Kh-22-32 missiles can probably destroy these bridges. And so I have no doubt could bombs as powerful and heavy as the FAB-3000s. So perhaps all of this pointing towards the offensive that's coming, the electricity substations knocked out, the power supplies knocked out across Ukraine, making it impossible, for example, for electrically powered trains, the vast majority of the trains that Ukraine has, to run, thereby preventing the Ukrainians moving troops around from one part of the front line to another. Well, that's one side of it. That's probably what the missile strikes are at least in part about. But also, with the steady depletion of the Ukrainian air defenses, which we're going to come to in a moment, more prospects for the Russian Air Force. They can approach, perhaps with greater confidence, Ukrainian targets more closely. They can drop these massive bombs on the Ukrainian fortifications, the heavy fortifications, and they can also start perhaps attacking the bridges over the Dnieper, other bridges as well, affecting Ukrainian communications, transport links even more. All of that possibly preparing for some big offensive that the Russians might be planning. Perhaps for later this summer, perhaps for early autumn, we shall see. Now, I want to, before I proceed to look at what's going on the battlefronts, the actual movements on the battlefronts, say something also about the questions of arms supplies and munitions. Now, Brian Beletic has done a magnificent program demolishing claims about supplies of Javelin and Stinger missiles to Ukraine. He's pointed out that these are dribs and drabs of these systems that are being supplied to Ukraine. We can say that with confidence because Brian Beletic has been able to establish through brilliant work, contacting the actual manufacturers, roughly how many of these missiles are being built. And we see that the United States is now so short of interceptors, Patriot missile interceptors, that it's had to twist the arms of its NATO allies to get them to agree to allow the United States to send all the Patriot missiles interceptors that had been assigned to them to Ukraine instead, which, as I said, is a sign of how desperately short the number of Patriot missile interceptors is becoming, that the United States simply cannot keep up with demands. Demands continue to increase all the time. And with Israel, of course, now apparently planning an incursion into southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah there. And with the United States the administration now having spoken about how the United States will back Israel fully in such an operation if it takes place. An extraordinary statement, by the way, from the administration, but it was one that they made. And with Hezbollah possessing a gigantic arsenal of missiles that it can launch against Israel, some claims say that they have up to 100,000 missiles they could launch. Well, it's likely that Israel, before long, is going to start demanding air defense interceptors from the United States. And the United States has just confirmed that it will be supplying more weapon systems to Taiwan. Apparently a several $100 million package has just been authorized for Taiwan. I'm not sure what it consists of. Perhaps it doesn't consist of Patriot missile interceptors. But I would have thought that sooner or later demands will increase for steps to protect Taiwan's air defenses. And of course the United States, drifting as it is into a confrontation with China, also needs air defense interceptors in the Pacific. So there is a crisis with interceptors, Patriot missile interceptors, which is why the United States now has to rob its European allies of Patriot missile interceptors, which, however, will not be anywhere close to being enough. It's likely that the Russians will be able to deplete even these additional Patriot missile interceptors even faster than they have previously, and they have shown over the course of this year that they are indeed fully capable of locating and destroying Patriot missile launchers and other air defense missile launchers right across the battlefronts as well. We had multiple pictures of this. So Russian aircraft probably will be able before long to approach the battlefronts more closer and to drop the FAB-3000s. So the air war, despite claims to the contrary, certainly over eastern Ukraine is being lost. And it's unlikely that the F-16s are going to be able to make any significant difference. In fact, there's been a report that the F-16s, in order to evade Russian air defenses, are going to have to fly so close to the ground that the capabilities of their missiles will be reduced. And by the way, as I think I discussed in another program, that will mean that it will take them more time to reach the battle lines in eastern Ukraine. And since they'll have to use up more fuel, presumably, that they will be able to stay there for less time than they otherwise would. Just saying. So, very difficult situation with missiles, air defense missiles. But I'm going to suggest that shells also remain a problem. Now, the United States has been making many claims about its increases in shell production. Now, by my understanding, there used to be one factory in the United States making 155 millimeter shells. At the time when the special military operation was launched, it was producing 14,155 millimeter shells a month, which was perhaps 3 days of use for the Ukrainian military. Now, that factory has apparently increased production. There's conflicting reports about the extent to which it's managed to do that. Some reports say 28,000, some say 36 or 38,000. I'm going to guess that the maximum output of 155 millimeter shells of this factory in any 1 month is probably no more than 38,000. I suspect that there are limits beyond which this factory cannot go, and that is the furthest that it realistically can. There's another factory which has apparently been built, and that apparently is slated to be able to produce around 30,000 shells a month, though it is probably going to take it a fair amount of time before it reaches that total. Bear in mind that the machine tools apparently have all been imported. I've heard it suggested that they've been imported from Turkey. Time will be needed to train a workforce to be able to operate these machine tools and to assemble the shells. That will probably take time too. It's probably going to take at least a year, possibly more, to reach 30,000 production of 30,000 shells. I've seen it suggested that by 2025, the United States might have increased production of shells to around 800,000 155 millimeter shells a year. That might be achievable, would just be achievable, if both of these factories were operating at full capacity at the very limit of their abilities. That might not happen. It might be difficult for the original factory to sustain production at a rate of 36 to 38,000 rounds a month, and it may take longer than the Americans expect for the new factory to reach production of 30,000 shells a month. But 800,000 shells a year certainly is a lot more shells than the United States was producing in 2022. But it's not going to be anywhere near enough. The Russians are producing, by most reports, around 4.5 million shells today. They're still expanding their production. They have trained, skilled workers in abundance. Russia still has those industrial skills. So it's likely that shell production in Russia is going to increase. And of course, we now have the question over North Korea and its role. Because the North Koreans are supposed to have provided the Russians with 5 million shells this year. Perhaps they have, perhaps they haven't, who knows? But as Putin hinted over the course of his press conference, one thing the North Koreans can do, and perhaps will increasingly be doing, is provide the Russians with skilled industrial workers. In fact, North Korea almost certainly has an oversupply, a substantial oversupply of these. And some of these workers will probably be working in the civilian economy in Russia, where there is now a labour shortage, but some of them might also start working in munitions production. Just say, apparently it's already possible for North Koreans to work in the Far East and the Vladivostok area. Apparently already regulations have been eased to allow them to do that, and it's likely that more of them will be working in Russia as well, across the rest of Russia as well. So it's likely that even as US production increases to 800,000 shells, the state of European production is even more of a mystery, but I believe, despite claims to the contrary, that it is significantly below American production. Well, even as the United States and the Europeans increase their production of shells, it's almost certain, it's almost baked in the cake, if you will, that Russian production is going to increase at an even faster rate, despite the fact that there is already a massive mismatch in production totals. So, again, we can see once more how the balance continues to shift. And it could be that this Russian offensive, when it comes this year, if it does come this year, will be the decisive event, and the Russians won't need all that additional production of shells. But it's a fundamental fallacy to think that the longer the war goes on for, the better Ukraine's position is going to be. On the contrary, the trends overwhelmingly are working against Ukraine. And on this issue, there's been another very interesting article by someone who's becoming an indispensable writer on this war, and that is Ian Proud, former British diplomat. And he's written on his blog, which I should say is its title is Ian Proud. He's written an article, The Ticking Bomb of Ukrainian Debt That the West Will Have to Pay. And he points out that the $50 billion loan that the West is now going to provide to Ukraine, or talking of providing to Ukraine, secured against the interest from Russian frozen assets, represents roughly the amount that Ukraine is already receiving from the West in any 1 year. And he says that Ukraine's economy is currently around $180 to $190 billion in size. 50 billion therefore represents around 20% of Ukraine's yearly GDP. This is a huge figure for a single loan. But the problem is that Ukraine has been borrowing this amount every year since the war started. According to Politico, Ukraine borrowed $58 billion in 2022, $46 billion in 2023, and is set to borrow $52 billion in 2024. So, in just 3 years, Ukraine will have borrowed 82% of its GDP. Ukraine needs to borrow this much because its government spends almost twice as much each year as it receives in income from taxation and other sources. And in fact, given the devastation of Ukraine's economy, given the collapse of the energy system, which we're likely to see, the final collapse of the energy system, which we're likely to see this winter, that tax state is going to fall even further. And he then goes on to say, to put that into context, the European Union sets a limit that member states cannot run a budget deficit of more than 3% of GDP. Ukraine, which aspires to join the EU, has been running a yearly budget deficit of 25% since the war began. In addition, Ukraine is running a deficit on its current account each year, the difference between how much it exports and imports. It also needs capital to stop its currency going into meltdown. So it has to borrow or receive funds to cover its budget deficit. It has to borrow, receive funds in order to keep its currency functioning. And he goes on to say that with Ukraine taking on 25% of its GDP in debt each year, and with its economy no larger than before the war started, in fact it's certain to be significantly smaller, the debt mountain will continue to spiral out of control. And the EU forecasts that Ukrainian debt is growing by 10% of GDP each year since the war started. But I view these figures, this is Ian Prout, with a heavy dose of skepticism. Even if Ukraine's economy grew by 5.5% in 2023, it was smaller than it was in 2021. The only reason why Ukraine is able to give these figures of 5.5% growth of GDP is precisely because of the loans and other financial transfers it is getting from the West. Absent those, and the reality almost certainly is that the Ukrainian economy is shrinking. And Ian Proud then goes on to say that Ukraine has become addicted to debt and that it has stopped paying loans, paying back its loans. He points out that this is actually a long-standing tradition with Ukraine. Ukraine basically defaulted on a loan of $3 billion it had received from Russia back in 2014. I remember that, by the way. And I remember that the Russians tried to enforce the loan through the British courts, and the British courts basically took what I thought was the extraordinary step of refusing to enforce the loan. But I'm not going to get into the details of that. But anyway, the point that's being made is that this debt burden is growing, is spiraling faster and faster. The Ukrainians probably hoped that they'd be able to cover this debt by seizing the $300 billion in Russian frozen assets. This is proving very, very difficult to do. Sooner or later, even if those assets are seized, this is going to become unsustainable. It is going to break down. You cannot just go on piling on debt at this level without eventually the entire financial system breaking down. And of course, already, even as I'm making this program, there are heated arguments between Ukraine and its creditors, its private creditors, its bond holders, about whether Ukraine should resume payments on its bonds in August. It's apparently holding out for massive haircuts, which the bondholders are refusing to, for the moment resisting agreeing to. But sooner or later, the bondholders are going to start to conclude that they're never going to be repaid, and trust is going to be lost, and we're likely going to see the first intimations of default. Now, none of this is going to happen soon. For the moment, support for Ukraine continues to come. But it cannot continue at this rate indefinitely, even if Ukraine does ultimately get its hands on these frozen Russian assets. The West cannot go on bankrolling Ukraine at the rate that it is doing. It is now starting to become a political issue in Europe. It was apparently so during the European Parliament elections in Germany and France, and Nigel Farage in Britain has just brought up the question of the origins of the Ukraine war over the course of the British general election. He's been the first British politician to come in during the election to come out openly and say that the war, the Russian decision to start the conflict, the special military operation in February 2022, was provoked. So, given that Farage is somebody who is very, very adept at feeling the currents of British opinion, it's likely that electorates across Europe, people across Europe, are beginning to tire of this endless financial support for Ukraine and the economic pressures that the sanctions war is inflicting upon them. And there are now the first hints that they're starting to rebel in France, in Germany, who knows, perhaps at some point even in Britain. So it's a mistake to think that time here is on Ukraine's side. It isn't. And, well, now let's talk about what's going on the battlefronts. First of all, let's go to what Group of Forces North are telling us in this area, which, as I said, I very much consider to be something of a sideshow in the war. But Group of Forces North have told us that in Volchansk, fierce fighting continues. Units of Group of Forces North repelled 3 counterattacks of the Ukrainian military, one in the area of the high-rise buildings, that is to say the citadel. They claim that they've achieved small advances in the area of the high-rise buildings. We've heard less, by the way, about what's going on in the aggregate plant. It's likely that there is still fighting going on in the aggregate plant. Most reports agree that the Russians have captured most of it. And Group of Forces North says that the total advance of Russian troops in Volchansk amounted to 100 meters. And the Russians say that in the Lipsy area, the Ukrainians made no attacks at all. And the Group of Forces North is now starting to cast doubt on the prospects of any Ukrainian counterattack in the Kharkiv area, and is hinting that the Ukrainians have perhaps despaired of their prospects in such a counterattack. Large losses of personnel are increasingly making Ukrainian commanders doubt their strength. The enemy began to use cluster munitions prohibited by international conventions. I'm not convinced that's true, by the way, and transferred to them by the United States against our positions as well as against civilians in Belgorod. during the operation in Kharkiv, we gained a lot of experience and learned to defend ourselves against any type of Western weaponry. But the Kiev regime's crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations. So basically what they're saying is, well, it's starting to look to us as if with all their counterattacks having failed, the Ukrainians themselves are starting to have doubts about the wisdom of conducting a counterattack in the Kharkiv area. And it could be, of course, that the demonstration of the potency of the FAB-3000 has also deterred the Ukrainians, at least to some degree. What's happening elsewhere on the battlefronts? Well, the first is that there are reports now that the Russians have made significant further advances, both in Chasiv Yar and in the Toretsk area. And the story of what has happened in these two places appears to be an exact product of the disastrous manpower and equipment shortages that the Ukrainians are increasingly suffering from. It seems that the Ukrainians decided to transfer troops from Chasiv Yar to what they believed was a quiet sector, which is the city of Toretsk, the town of Toretsk in central Donbass. So the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, which has been fighting in Chasiv Yar and has been absolutely mauled by the Russians, was to be transferred to Toretsk, and the 24th Mechanized Brigade, which up to then had been guarding Toretsk, was to be transferred to Chasiv Yar. The Russians got wind of the fact that these two units were swapping places. They seized the opportunity. They launched a significant attack towards Toretsk. They've now captured a village, which is actually, from what the map that I can see, an outer suburb of Toretsk, a village called Shuma. They're now on the they're now on the edge of New York, another village which forms part of the Toretsk conurbation. It looks like they're about to break into Toretsk itself, or have reached Toretsk itself. And in the meantime, this attempt by the Ukrainians to rotate troops from one part of the battlefront to another created a gap in Chasiv Yar, and it looks as if the Russians there, the 98th Airborne Division, seized again the opportunity to capture a large area, a large forested and area to the south of the village of Kalinova, which they are also in the process of capturing, which has significantly increased the area that the Russians control on the east bank of the aqueduct and to the north of the micro-district. And it seems also as if the 24th Mechanized Brigade, having arrived in the area, despite the fact that it's fresh, it apparently includes large numbers of recently called up reservists. It's apparently found it impossible to withstand the pressure that the Russians in Chasiv Yar are placing upon it. So, not perhaps a disaster for the Ukrainians in Toretsk or Chasiv Yar, but another sign of how aggressive attrition is working, how the Russians are able to gain ground even as they exert this pressure on the Ukrainians all the time. And in the area where perhaps the battle, the big Russian offensive, is going to come, we now have further confirmation that the Russians are now pushing north from Novo Alexandrovka and Arkhangelsk towards this key road, the one that provides the supplies, the Ukrainian supplies from Pokrovsk in the west to Konstantinovka, Chasov Yar and Toretsk further east. And there's been sightings now, filmed sightings, of the Russian troops basically closing in on this village of Kalinovka, north of Arkhangelskoye. It does look as if the Russians are now seriously approaching this village, as it seems that they have successfully, or are close to successfully, clearing the Ukrainians from the villages to the west, places like Sokol, Yevgenia, another village called Progress, and also further south, Karlovka, of which the Russians now claim that they control more than 50% of that particular village. So it's not true that the Russians aren't advancing. They appear to be advancing, according to Group of Forces North, in Volchansk itself. This is a grinding battle that is taking place there. Perhaps before long we're going to see the FAB-3000s used in Volchansk itself. The first strikes with the FAB-3000s suggested that the system still needs some tweaking to make it a little more accurate, but presumably now that the system is being used, it will be brought to bear, maybe against remaining Ukrainian defences in the high-rise buildings area in Volchansk. We might see a collapse under the weight of these bombs of Ukrainian resistance in Volchansk. Who knows? Anyway, the Russians advancing in Volchansk, advancing in Chasov Yar, advancing in Toretsk as well. In fact, as Andrei Belousov, the Russian defense minister, has said, they are retaining the initiative right across the contact lines, and they are inflicting horrific losses. 13,740 men, according to what they claim. And as I said, there's reasons to think that it's true. 13,740 losses over the course of the previous week. Aggressive attrition grinds on, and there is nothing short of a decision to begin negotiations and to seek peace that can change either it or the course of this war. Well, this is where I finish my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop. Some of you, no doubt, are following the football. If so, well, you can buy all our shirts, football 24 shirts, this one, for example, but lots of others as well. You can see the whole range. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. This is where it ends. Have a very good day.